white people need to understand the roots of racism and the continuing consequences of that period, and the period after. Led the world in transatlantic chattel slavery. Nobody stole and shipped more African people than the British, their descendants, whom we murdered and enslaved, who we treated like farm animals, and whose names we erased from history.
We are pleased to be joined by Alex Renton, author, journalist, and broadcaster, to speak a bit about slavery, his book, Blood Legacy, and more. I do first want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us, though.
Brandon, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, the pleasure's all ours. So I do want to start with your book, Blood Legacy, where you kind of explore your own family's ties to slavery. What did you take from that experience that you think more people should be willing to learn about slavery and racism and all that comes with it today?
My country, which led the world in transatlantic chattel slavery. Nobody stole and shipped more African people than the British, apart from the Portuguese, to Brazil. But we over 250 years indulged in that incredibly cruel, totally racist, greedy enterprise, which involved mass murder, and we've been in denial about it ever since because we offshored it. If it had happened in Sussex or Perthshire in Scotland where I lived, we wouldn't be able to avoid it. But it happened 5,000 miles away in the States or in the Caribbean. And I'm the elite education here in Britain, and I was taught propaganda, nonsense. I was taught that the British led the world in abolishing slavery, and that's what we should be proud of and talk about, not about the 3.1 million African people and all their descendants whom we murdered and enslaved, who we treated like farm animals, and whose names we erased from history. I thought the time had come really to talk about this, because I had this history from my own family, which I discovered. I didn't know about it until I was 50, and that I had a unique ability to bring this to tell this story, and I had a duty to do it. And most of all, I think the other thing was to go and ask the people or the descendants of the people whom we'd enslaved. In my family, this is Jamaica and Tobago, what they thought, how it affected them now, and what people like me should do about it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you spoke kind of about propaganda and how you were taught in schools like we led the way. That kind of draws a lot of parallels to how it is in America. I think in both probably Britain and America, many kind of struggle to kind of reconcile or come to terms with what has happened. I'm curious, and obviously big question, but like, how do you think we move past that to a point where we can kind of have these conversations that may be uncomfortable for some?
It's incremental, and I think with each generation that'll get bigger, so long as we resist the forces trying to reimpose the false history. And I think it is primarily about education, and I think one of the key things to that, certainly in this country, where there are about 400,000 people who are directly descended from the enslaved, who are British people, black British people, that is about opening up that history, teaching it honestly, mainstreaming it, but also making it into something from which we can build, painting it. Because here I talk to a lot of people racialized as black about how they think people like me should deal with it, and of course people say, don't tell my children that they're trauma, they've inherited trauma, that they're inherently damaged from the day because of this past. Tell them they have something to build on, but also something which explains some of the racism and the disadvantages that the black community face today. So it's really, my own kids, before I did this project, were taught a lot better than me. And I now teach a lot in British schools on this, but we're still a long way behind the full, frank, honesty that can enable us to go forward together as a nation.
Yeah, and I believe in the book you interviewed some still living in, I think it was the Caribbean. I'm sure you've spoken to others as well. Having put a book like this out, I'm sure you've heard other tales. What do you think are some of the effects that could still that people still feel on either side, either descendants of those who enslaved people or those who were the slaves themselves?
I think, I mean, the effects are huge in Britain. I mean, and obviously the former British colonies in the Caribbean, one of our responsibility, we have responsibilities there too. But I mean, in Britain, we have systemic racism, and we have a whole load of social indicators, from health through to educational achievement through to crime figures, and which show that the black community is unfairly and inequitably affected by racism. And I think one of the key things is connecting that racism with what enabled my ancestors, whose letters I've read, who don't feel very far away from me, to commit this appalling act. That it is the same racism that affects people's lives today. The really pleasing thing about producing that book and it getting a bit of publicity and some, some sales is a lot more people like me have come forward and started acknowledging and addressing that past, and just starting conversations, and I've been part of trying to enable that, which feels very pleasing.
I'm curious if you think that in terms of like obviously the racism that still exists today and the effects that it has, do you think kind of coming to terms with the past, with people like yourself coming forward to speak about their stories or these kinds of things, do you think that's kind of a key first step to kind of dealing with these effects that we still do see today?
I think it's yeah, key first step, but and there's two sides to it as well, which is white people need to understand the roots of racism and the continuing consequences of that period, and the period after enslavement in the Caribbean, particularly where we ruled those countries and continued to exploit them and the people there. But also that's about white people acknowledging their own privilege. So I come, from a family that was very wealthy because of enslavement in the 19th century, um, and uh, and thinks very, like a lot of elites, or upper class, if you like, British families, thinks very well of itself and thinks somehow that they earned the power that they have even today through decency and being good, and but by right. But in fact, it just comes from that money, and that money comes from murder. And I think being a little less smug about, you know, Great Britain, if you like, this nation that led the civilization of the world, which is a line you still hear quite a lot, and more about the actual reality of it, and learning some humility and learning to listen to less advantaged people, and not tell them what to think. Those learning lessons for people like me are really important.